Please welcome with me our 4 panelists on the stage: Graham Alabaster, Alexandra Knezovich, Manuel Schiffler, and Stefan Reuter. Can I see everyone? Yes. Is this on? Yes. Everyone else has a microphone? Yes. Perfect. Graham, you have been working for the UN Habitat for 25 years, and there you have played a key role in building the water, sanitation, and infrastructure branch. Now your work is hosted at the World Health Organization, but you're still on the same topic. That means working to reach the Sustainable Development Goal number 6 to promote clean water and sanitation for all. Graham, what has been the most exciting development in the past years for you in that area?
Well, I think there's been several things that have happened. I think, as the Minister already said, this recognition of sanitation now as being just as important, if not more important, if we are to benefit from provision of good infrastructure and improving people's healths. But I think perhaps more recently, the idea of the SDGs and the great opportunity that they actually have, moving away from the idea that it's something up in the clouds, which is a very high-level thing which doesn't have any applicability at the local level. I think people are beginning to understand now that really the SDG is an opportunity for us to do business better in what we do and to monitor more closely what we do. And that's one of the things that the water sector as a whole needs desperately, because the water sector is fragmented. The people who deal with clean water and drinking water don't necessarily speak to the people who deal with wastewater, and there's a need to understand the impact that one has on the other. I do a lot of work on wastewater and the sort of work that BORDA do, but really the communities who deal with wastewater don't speak so much to the people who deal with water quality. So, you know, we need to use this as an opportunity to work better, do business better.
So what then are still the biggest problems in the field?
The biggest problems are the fragmentation of the water sector across the different goals, and the fragmentation between the provision of water and sanitation and the people who do that, and the health sector, and understanding the linkages, and of how really curative approaches are not going to be, you know, they're important of course, but if we forget the prevention approaches of providing good water and sanitation, we risk going backwards. In fact, you know, the issue of like antimicrobial drug resistance, which we hear about, is something that's very real. And, you know, in 20 years' time, if we don't take a preventative approach to sanitation and wastewater, people could be dying of diseases that they died of 30 years ago. So really, it's a very, very important issue. So that's the thing that I worry about. I worry that this idea that we need to, prevention is better than cure, needs to be ingrained in, you know, the different ministries that we work with and different partners.
Stefan, BORDA has been in the field for 40 years now. We've heard it before. And in contrast to other NGOs, BORDA has never provided a one-size-fits-all solution, if I may say that. However, your approach has also changed over the years. So what is BORDA doing differently now than 40 years ago?
Thank you very much for the question, and again, thank you very much for spending this wonderful evening here with us at the Bremen representation. What are we doing differently 40 years ago? The key part, you know, where we started from was how can we turn a threat like the oil crisis into an opportunity? So in the beginning, we very much unmantled the do's and don'ts about how to make renewable energy available where people are in need of. And then our second step, when we understand the technology, the place it is needed, people don't necessarily have access to. So it was a lot of knowledge management and transfer. Now, today, we're sitting in the city of Berlin, and the city of Berlin has built its trunk sewer network over a period of 35 years. So we have only 15 or 14 or 13 years back to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. But the kind of transformation we are in is a long shot. So we really need to mobilize today all the resources we have which are in our brains and in partnerships, in order to not only crack the nut about the technology, but move the whole sector. And I think this is where we don't focus on the technology any longer, but where we look at smart partnerships where everyone can play their role, and we are prepared to really go on the next 40 years in accompanying this kind of process. But we now want to pull in the Bremer Stadtwerke, Hansewasser Bremen, our utilities in Bremen and Hamburg and other places in order to be able to play that role. Move in private sector, we are going to discuss this hopefully later. Thank you.
And how does this go together with the fragmentation that Graham just mentioned? How do you see that?
Well, first of all, to give you an example, we do have some kind of fragmentation in Germany as well. While the Minister of Environment is trying to reduce the discharge standards and minimize the impact of disadvantaged substances to the environment, our Minister of Agriculture is protecting the continued use of fertilizer in a kind of business as usual mode. So we need to integrate these two different things, and that's our own issue as well. What I, again, very much support in Graham's statement is the big progress will not be done by technology, will not be done by overcoming and connecting one ministry to the other. It will be done by two things. One is trust among the actors and learning. So nobody will have the silver bullet. Lots of technologies are out there and they will all be helpful, but if we don't engage and create the enabling environment for learning, have a trusted relationship between all the different actors, and then can progressively reach the targets which are there, then we have done something wrong. So this is where I like this statement very much. Thank you.
So BORDA has been in the field for 40 years. To my right is someone who is with a really young company in contrast. The Toilet Board Coalition was only founded in 2014. So Alexandra, you're a program manager at the Toilet Board Coalition, and I can imagine that if you tell people where you work, they start sniggering. So what do you tell them what you actually do once they stop sniggering?
Absolutely. Yes. Well, I mean, I come from a non-sanitation world, more of a media world, and came to the Toilet Board Coalition through working with our executive director, Cheryl Hicks. And so often when I relate to people what I do from my network, it's, what? Toilets? But wait. And I think a big part about what we do is really changing that conversation from what to wow. And one of the ways that we're doing that, and that for me is really exciting, so we have an accelerator, a toilet accelerator, and we work with entrepreneurs in the Southern Hemisphere. We create bespoke projects with our multinational corporations, which are our founders, to create breakthrough cases in the sanitation business community. And so one of the ways that we're working on doing that, Stefan was speaking about creating enabling environments. And right now we're working on smart sanitation. So we like to say that we believe toilets, the 2.4 billion people without toilets, is actually the business opportunity of the decade. Providing those toilets is a huge business opportunity if there are entrepreneurs that are willing to meet it, that are equipped to meet it. And so what we look for is things that can really change the sector, that can transform it. Outside of the accelerator, where we're working in a very specific capacity, one-on-one, we also look at thought leadership opportunities. So last year we focused a lot on the circular economy, using what we call toilet resources rather than human waste, as valuable, looking at the valuable products that they are, which Stefan knows very well about. And then this year, what we're focusing on is smart sanitation. So those 2.4 billion toilets that we'll install in the next decade, they don't need to be dumb buckets. They can be medical tools that can tell you about your nutritional deficiencies, that can prevent disease outbreak. We have the technology these days, the sensors, the data management, et cetera, to really transform this industry in the same way that our phones have transformed in the last decade from something that we just called people on to a whole new device. So we see that happening with the toilet in the next 10 years.
So how big is the program right now? How many small enterprises are you supporting?
Yeah, so in the Toilet Accelerator program itself, we work with between 5 to 10 enterprises each year, and then sometimes it can be for a year to 18 months. Beyond that, we've added this year another program called Fast Forward, which is designed to take some of the community and expertise of the Toilet Board Coalition and make it available to a wider audience. So we have about 100 entrepreneurs enrolled in that, and that's a series of webinars and communication, interactive experiences for them within their own community and then also with experts in the field.
And the idea is what? They get support for a year and then what?
Oh, no, not just a year. No, so it's, for us, we're really focused on the strategic inputs that we can give and that only we can give. I think one of my favorite things about my job is what we don't do. And it's the incredible people that are in this room, that are on this panel that do all those other things. So we're very focused on scaling up business solutions to sanitation for the low-income consumer. And so what the future is, I mean, I think we're still figuring that out. Definitely the accelerator will continue. It's about, I think, building this business community in a larger context. So the first step was the accelerator. The second step is this fast forward, sort of a larger online community. The third step is to be determined.
Okay. Manuel, the Toilet Board Coalition sees the business opportunity of the decade, as Alexandra just said. But you write in your book that there are still millions or even billions of dollars missing in investments in the water and sanitation industry. Manuel, why is it so hard to make money there?
That's a very good question. I think you can make a business if there's a demand, and the demand does not only mean that there is a need, but it has to be a solvent demand. And unfortunately, we do not see that in the case of sanitation in many countries. So I think it's a real challenge. You are not the first organization who has tried to turn sanitation into a business. So I think the road is littered, unfortunately, with quite a number of failures. I'm curious to see whether your organization can make a difference where others haven't made much of a difference so far.
People are very skeptical when it comes to privatizing water. In your book, I can show it, by the way. I have one hard copy here, hard copy book. In your book, Water, Politics and Money, a reality check on privatization, you look at data to find a fact-based answer to the question, is privatization actually good or bad? And, okay, breaking the suspense here, there is no, there is no perfect solution, but what is your conclusion?
Well, the title of the book is not as an accident, it's Water, Politics and Money, because sometimes people forget about the political dimension and the dimension of financing of money. I have heard talk about knowledge and learning and trust, and all these things are very important, but the money has to come from somewhere. So I have worked as a researcher, so I have the mind of a researcher, so I always try to look at the empirical evidence. And then I worked at the World Bank for 12 years, where I worked on water supply and sanitation in many different parts of the world. And as most of you know, the World Bank has pushed privatization quite heavily in all kinds of sectors. Here in Germany, almost everybody I talk to would say, well, water supply and privatization, stay away from it. We had an experience here in Berlin, we had a referendum, and actually the privatization was turned back. There was a remunicipalization here in Berlin. Actually, one of the chapters in my book looks also at that experience. I won't go into the details now because there's not enough time for it. And I do not look only at the cases of privatized utilities, but also at public utilities. About 90% of the utilities in the world are are public companies. Just 10% are private. In Germany, almost all of them are practically public utilities. And utilities are key actors in the change if we want to achieve the sustainable, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I look at what makes a utility turn around from a poorly performing utility to a functioning utility. And let's just give two examples of two extremes. If you look at Egypt, Egypt has terrible utilities. The water bill, the water is practically free. It's almost not worth the amount of effort to send out the bill, and so, if the bill is $1 per month. And then the utilities are a huge drain on the public budget. Egypt is not such a rich country. Why should the government spend its limited fund on this and not on education or on health or other activities? Some money should go into water supply and sanitation, but recurrent costs, the cost of salaries, should that really be paid out of the public budget, especially if we have utilities that have 3 or 4 times more employees than are actually needed. So, and unfortunately, the infrastructure is not well maintained, and we see that in many countries. So donors come, NGOs, public donors, whoever, the World Bank, they build infrastructure, and if the utilities are in bad shape, if they're not financially solid, the infrastructure is not well maintained, we don't have professional utilities, we have corruption, and the whole thing breaks down and someone comes and asks for more money to rebuild the same infrastructure, which is quite frustrating. But fortunately, there is some hope. So there are a couple of good examples in the book. The Manila example, where privatization has actually been successful, might come as a surprise to some. Water losses, non-revenue water has been cut down dramatically. Water supply went from intermittent to continuous supply. The efficiency of the utility improved. Unfortunately, all the success has been on the water side and very little success on the sanitation side, which underlines what I think Graham said, or I think you said it as well. I mean, we as professionals, we all know it's a water business is difficult enough, but sanitation, unfortunately, is much more difficult.
When you hear this, Alexandra, how do you think does it relate to the programs and initiatives you support? Can you be a little bit more specific?
Yeah, absolutely. So Manila Water is a part of the coalition, actually. And so we work... Manila Water, Manila, yes. And so we work, we work quite closely with them and are helping to bring sanitation into what they're doing. So in last year's accelerator was Laguna Water, which is a subsidiary company of Manila, and they are launching later this year a sanitation service alongside their water provision. And we know, I mean, we're a young organization and are very upfront about that, and I certainly hope that what we do will work, and I do believe it. Last year, one of our accelerator companies, SVADA, is based in India. They were working with Kimberly-Clark, one of our founding members, and for us, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but it's really about finding where is the strategic input for us. What can only we do as an organization? And then let's do that the best we possibly can. So with SVADA, we had an entrepreneur, Garima, who knew exactly what she needed in terms of her business growth. She needed marketing, she needed logistics, supply, and she needed a little bit of R&D help. So we sourced that within Kimberly-Clark. They worked together for about 8 months, and SVADA had a 200% increase in the revenue in 8 months. It's completely turned around their projections for the next year, 5 years. I mean, it's worked in that sense. We won't have, you know, all of those stories, most definitely, but it's trying to find where are those where only we can do what we can do, and then let's help work within the network, work within the sanitation community to bring the support that we can't offer to help drive us all forward.
You already mentioned Kimberly-Clark. There's also Unilever in the Toilet Board Coalition. How come they are interested in promoting clean water and sanitation for all?
Yeah, I mean, well, Unilever has, I remember when it was like my first week with the Toilet Board, and we had a board meeting, and I got to hear one of our board members, Charlie Beaver, is, I believe, head of household and care for Unilever. And he was speaking on why Unilever is a part of the Toilet Board Coalition, and he said, doing good is good business. It's a company mantra for them. It's, I believe, a bit of a well-known phrase. But it is, you know, and all of our corporate members truly believe that. It's about a business interest. They're interested in these markets. If people have toilets, then they need toilet cleaner. Then they need toilet paper. I mean, they're very upfront about that. And they're seeing it, you know, I mean, the return on value for them being a part of the mentorship programs and working the accelerator with us is incredible in terms of their talent recruitment, their employee satisfaction, to be able to, when you're working in a huge multinational corporation, to have a call with an entrepreneur in India and tell them that work with them on their logo redesign, and within 3 days it's completely rebranded across their entire website and all of their materials. For someone at Kimberly-Clark who it takes years to get something like that done, it can be very rewarding. So, yeah.
However, your budget is not super amazing generous, and you, I mean, okay, what's your budget?
I don't know if I'm I don't know.
Okay, so
we are well funded. We as an organization do not provide grants ourselves. So to the entrepreneurs that are a part of the accelerator program, there's not funding attached to that. We work within our network. We have 5 international development banks on our coalition. We work with incredible other organizations that are looking to fund the sector and to help to make where we can. But so we as an organization don't fund, but we are taken care of by our
You're taken care
by
of.
our funders.
It's good to know. I mean, you know the critics. Is this more than just greenwashing for the big companies?
I think you'd have to sit in our board meetings to really understand it, but 100%. I mean, these people are so engaged. We work really hard at what we do, but when the coalition comes together and we get to sit in that room and see the energy and see the drive, and I see on a daily basis how our members put themselves out within their corporations to drive forward the cases of these entrepreneurs and to see how much they can do, how far they can reach to make this happen for them. I mean, it's inspiring for me, and I think, I hope that as we continue on our path and we make these stories more known, that will engage more people as well, and that they'll get to see what it's really about.
Graham, when you hear this, as I said, as a veteran of water and sanitation business, what do you think? What do you think about private-public partnerships and initiatives like the Toilet Board Coalition?
I'm very much in favour of public-private partnerships, providing they're regulated properly. I mean, I think this has been the problem in the past, and it's certainly learning from experience in the health sector. If these partnerships aren't monitored and the level of services drop down, then they don't work. So you have to have good monitoring in place, good regulation in place, and the regulation probably can go a bit beyond what we normally think of regulation. On water and sanitation, we can now increasingly rely on communities to give feedback on the level of services that they're getting and whether they're good enough. We heard earlier mentioned about the right to water and understanding this right. So this regulation has now taken on a wider form. So I think public-private partnerships are good. The other issue about them is that we always think of them as being huge, large relationships between for big projects, but they can actually be used in smaller opportunities. And I mean, if we go down to a unit of a municipality, there's no reason why, particularly with a decentralized treatment facility, we can't look at a sort of local level of public-private partnership to reach an end. You may find a community that lives in close proximity to a particular industry, for example, in the developing world. There's no reason why you shouldn't look at an innovative type of public-private partnership there. So I'm all in favor, providing they're properly regulated.
And what kind of regulations do you see there? Like, I heard that probably more regulated than they have been in the past?
much more regulated than they have been in the past. I mean, I think the thing is that it's not just about standards and technology and quality, it's also about governance as well, because we know that quite often the governance in some of those situations falls down. So it's not just the technology, it's a need to look at the governance of those relationships and how they're managed properly.
Manuel, I think you can relate to that. You analyzed different private-public partnerships in the water and sanitation industry. Some of them failed and some of them succeeded. Could you sum up what is most important for a successful private-public partnership in your findings?
First, let me clarify what I understand by public-private partnerships. I talk about utilities, and you mentioned the Toilet World Coalition, it's called, right? Mm-hmm. Toilet World Coalition as a public-private partnership. So different people understand very different things under that term. So I have not dealt with cases where big private companies start to create outfits to do good. So that is not the subject of my book. But perhaps regulation is also important for those companies, because the most important thing that we need to achieve the financing of sustainable development goals is taxes. So in some of the multinational companies, I'm not sure about the ones named here, do not really pay the taxes that they should pay because they're transferred from one country to the other. So I think we should think about that as well and compare it perhaps to the budget of the coalitions that they create to do good things. Now, coming back to the subject of my book, so public-private partnerships in utilities, I think regulation is a tough thing to do. The one country, Graham, you're from Britain, right? Yeah. So the one country that probably has the most extensive experience with the regulation of water and sanitation utilities is England, not the United Kingdom, but England. You have to know when Margaret Thatcher privatized water supply and sanitation in England and Wales at the time. Wales has gone back, but England is still privatized. Scotland, which was sort of Labour-dominated, said no thank you. So maybe that was the first step towards creating their own, whatever, country or so. But it remained public in Scotland. It remained public in Northern Ireland. Actually, Northern Ireland, to my knowledge, is the only part of the OECD where drinking water is free. The Republic of Ireland was the other part, and but they, after the crisis, they had to introduce water tariffs. It's a whole other debate, should water be free or not? But it's interesting, Northern Ireland, I don't know a lot about it, but it's not a disaster in terms of water supply and sanitation, and they do it with tax funding. Anyway, England has had a lot of trouble to get regulation right. What do you have to regulate? You have to regulate the tariff. You have a private monopoly. So you have to make sure that profits are not excessive. And you have 5-year regulatory periods in England. And under the first period, the profits got excessive. It's just the regulators didn't get it right. It's very hard to look exactly at the costs and to make sure that over a 5-year period, the profits are at a level that is sort of appropriate, whatever the appropriate level of a profit is, but there is this kind of concept. And then there was a change in government, and Tony Blair came, and there was a different regulator. It's, of course, not the Prime Minister who regulates the utilities, but Ofwat's a regulatory agency. And they changed it. They pushed down the tariffs. And actually, the utilities made losses, and they had trouble to keep up with the investments that they had to commit under the 5-year investment plans that they had to submit. So it has sort of been a yo-yo thing, and we could talk about service quality, which is also regulated, where there are also some issues. Just to give an example of sewers. I mean, how do you make sure that sewers are of a good quality? It's underground. I mean, these things, sometimes they come from Victorian times. How much money do you have to spend to maintain them? And that's another big challenge. So regulating a private monopoly is something very difficult. And Graham said we should have more regulation. I would counter and say it's so difficult that even if Ofwat had even more people or more legal powers, I'm not sure if they would be able to do a better job because it's inherently difficult. And in my book, I say, actually, in terms of performance, based on the empirical evidence, there's not such a huge difference between a private utility and a public utility. The UK is a wonderful natural experiment comparing Scotland and England and Wales. All the details are in the book. But if you'd ask me now, should we privatize in any country in the world, I would rather say no, because there have been as many failures and successes. But the political cost of doing it, the transaction costs, all the lawyers, all the advisors you have to hire, the regulatory capacity you have to create in the public sector to regulate a private utility. If even England, the oldest democracy in the world with a well-functioning, well-paid professional administration, hasn't got it right, how can Tanzania or Nicaragua get it right?
You also write that the culture in companies has to change, or in your findings that it plays a very important role. Could you elaborate on that a little?
Thank you very much. I wondered if public and private doesn't make a difference. What does make a difference? Why do some utilities turn from being very bad to well-functioning good utilities that provide affordable services to their clients? And why do others fail? And I tried to look at some common traits. And one common trait was actually a change in corporate culture. So if a utility is totally unprofessional, if there is a high level of corruption, if there is centralized decision-making, people are unmotivated, you can pour a lot of money into that utility, you will not achieve a lot. And a lot of knowledge and, well, trust. Trust is actually a good one, I like it, because trust is related to corporate culture. If you create a corporate culture where you empower lower levels of organization within the utility to make independent decisions and you reward them either with money or in other ways. In the case of Uganda, they looked at performance indicators and they made a big party. They threw a party with roast bulling. Bull roasting. They roasted a bull, right? And they loved it, the African guys. They were in a small town, National Water and Sewer Company, and nobody cared about these guys. Suddenly people told them, you have a performance contract, you have targets, we're going to monitor if you achieve them. Just 50 guys or so, small town branch of a national utility, and they achieve it, and the boss of the company gives them a pat on the back, some money in their account, and a big bull roasting party. So, I mean, and this case of Uganda, the general manager has changed the corporate culture of that company. He couldn't do it alone, he needed to have public backing from the government, because one of the problems was that the public sector didn't pay their bills. He went to the hospitals, to the army barracks, to the schools, to the universities, to the mayor's office in the capital, and they didn't pay their bills. I mean, so what do you do? They said, well, we don't have the budget. So he went to talk to the Minister of Finance, and the president of the country told the Minister of Finance, make sure that all these entities have in their budget enough money to pay their water bills. And he also needed to increase the tariffs. If you have a water bill or sewer bill of $1 per month, you're not going to be able to run a utility. So he had to increase tariffs, and politicians have to be courageous. You don't win elections by saying, I will increase water tariffs. But some people still do it, usually after the elections, and I don't blame them, because there's perhaps no other way of doing it. And so changes in corporate culture have been important, both in the public sector cases, as in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, which is my favorite chapter in there, as in Uganda, and also in the private cases like in Manila Water.
So we need bull roasting parties, courageous politicians. Stefan, a lot of NGOs or a lot of people who work at NGOs are skeptical about private-public partnerships, but BORDA is trying to have more of those. Where do you see the future there?
I would like to start with a point on corporate culture and governance. I give you an example.
And then bull roasting.
Yes, come on. So here's the point. In a country where it's about water supply and sanitation, you don't necessarily ask about the technology they use or the water losses. You ask, how does political elections take place and are paid for? In Germany, political elections to the majority are paid for by taxes and by a scheme which is publicly funded. So the campaign, thank you very much, the electoral campaign is funded through taxes and public finance. In India, it's not. In the US, it's not. In a number of countries, the money which is paid for, so the local utility also has in some way or the other contribute to the electoral campaigns. So ring fencing those budgets with the utility is part of getting to a governance how money can stay inside the system, so that when we finance, I didn't mention finance in my first introduction, but finance is key. I don't think that we tremendously, that is misfinanced. There's the high willingness, but if that money which is there would stay in the system, we would be much better off and not drain out. So this is point one, where public-private partnerships may be subject to a governance system where money drains out of it or stays in it. So it's not whether it's public or private that it will perform better or not, but it's whether, as an example, money stays in the sector. Here comes example now to your question. In Europe, and also specifically in Germany, we have secured fire protection to chimney sweepers, which are private companies, but which are regulated by the municipality. And for the fire security of the neighborhood, I cannot deny the chimney sweeper to clean my chimney so that there's no fire outbreak. Here we talk about cholera outbreak. And I need skilled people, I need private sector, I need smart tools, I need what private sector is best at. But these guys, which we often train to empty septic tanks and empty pits, they should make a living out of that. And the sector should be regulated in the way that these guys take pride in having a job, sending their kids to school, but they don't need necessarily to be employed by the utility, because the utility may hopefully take care of the main sewer trunk. But there needs to be a connection between those, not chimney sweepers here, but pit emptiers and those sludge truck drivers or honeysuckers. And that needs to work in a smart way. So here we have not necessarily a utility, but a connection between private entrepreneurs who make a living out of, for you it's shit, for me it's butter and bread, right? So they should make a living out of that, and this is an example for chimney sweepers. It's regulated, it's working, and we provide access, no question. So in that direction.
So can you tell us about concrete projects BORDA has in that field?
Well, actually, we are having small entrepreneurs who now understand how to empty pits. There's an example from Tanzania where initially it wasn't a full company, but it was a kind of association, but run with a real entrepreneurial spirit. And this guy managed to get paid for by the neighborhood for the emptying service. Unfortunately, there was no real wastewater treatment system where we said, oh, he has cracked the most difficult nut to get access to the premises and people paying something for that. Let us take care of how to now do the treatment. And so this combination is now taken up by a World Bank program in Dar es Salaam, where they want to invest into 50 systems like that one. Lots of headaches ahead, because from one smart example you don't necessarily scale to, it's specific to the neighborhood, but this is what we need to accompany. So there are good examples. I think what is needed is that organizations like ours accompany the process, facilitate and fill in where the standard procurement process and tendering for consultancy services may end up in some, you know, unclear situations. But I see that now taking place in Dar es Salaam, in Nairobi. We have a number of places where this is still to happen. In Durban, South Africa, it's happening. And then there comes a last example from Indonesia, where it's about co-management. Look, in Indonesia, the decentralized sanitation approach has ended up making neighborhood organizations, community-based organizations, responsible for a public health hazard, if you like, the operation and maintenance of a wastewater treatment facility. So here it's about a smart co-management, a co-management between the local community-based organizations and the local municipality, and that's not yet sufficiently financed. We need to bridge that, but that's another example where we already have like more than 500 of these community-based organizations grouped into an umbrella organization so that they have more power when talking to municipalities or national government. Some bits and pieces here and there.
Okay. Graham, you work at the WHO also on drawing up guidelines and drawing up policies. What do you think, what has to change politically so that we can actually reach the SDGs by 2030?
Okay, there's two parts to the question there. I mean, I think the guidelines part is very, very important, because basically if the guidelines that are given to countries are so difficult to implement or so difficult to achieve, most countries are going to leave them on the bookshelf and not use them. So what we have to do is we have to design, and we call it a sort of progressive approach, but we have to, particularly with the monitoring of the SDGs, we have to design a sort of ladder where resource-constrained countries can still see a place of how they can monitor in a basic way, but as countries become more advanced and they have more resources, then they can progress higher up the ladder and have a more complex monitoring framework. And the issue of wastewater is a good example. You know, if a country is very resource constrained, if they can just measure one or two parameters to ensure that their wastewater is achieving a bacteriological standard, for example, or you know, the suspended solids or carbon, that's fine. But then in the more developed countries, you'd be expecting countries, Europe, US, to be very closely monitoring sort of, you know, discharge of priority pollutants and hazardous substances. I mean, there's a lot of talk around about antimicrobial drug resistance. Those are the things that the advanced countries have to have in their monitoring framework. It's way too advanced for the poorer countries. So I think, you know, by having this ladder and designing guidelines which countries can see are realistic and they can be applied across the board, that's the biggest challenge.
Thank you. Thank you for the first round of input and ideas. Now I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. You can ask in English or in German. Sie können gerne auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch fragen. Wir haben hier, oder wir sollten hier Menschen haben, die mit Mikrofon durch die Gegend gehen und die Fragen einsammeln. Und für diejenigen, die online zuschauen, auch Sie können gerne Fragen stellen.
Likewise, that we will also submit here to the panel.
Mikro? Eigentlich sollte es noch welche geben. Okay, da kommt die erste Frage.
Here comes the first question.
Yes, my name's Sam Lowenberg, and I'm a journalist, and I have covered WASH in many countries around the world, WASH issues. And I'm wondering if you can give some examples specific to slums where there has been a positive change, and where the thing that I'm thinking, and maybe this is not what you'll say in your experience, but I've seen a lot of small projects in slums, a lot of, you know, relatively little things, and I've always kind of come away thinking, you know, what they really need is just big infrastructure, just like you do for the wealthier people in the city, and the way that we have it in Europe or the United States. And I'm wondering if there's any of you have come across a case where that's actually happened, and if maybe if you can tell sort of how that happened, because you're getting into the politics and the financing there.
And that's a question to all of the panel or to someone?
Well, I maybe we could start with
Graham.
With Graham, yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, slums are the big challenge, of course, as you know. If you look at regions like sub-Saharan Africa, of all the urban populations in those regions, 60% live in slums. So it's a large proportion. And provision of services to those people should be a top priority. It should be a top priority for governments. I actually believe that the adapted type of network systems are very, very good. And I mean the ideas of low-cost sewerage applied in slums are very important. And they're very useful, but I also accept the fact that we can't change the status quo overnight and that we're going to be faced with on-site sanitation for some time to come. But there are places where this has worked very well, and things like condominial approaches and low-cost sewerage have worked very well in countries like Brazil, where the sanitary engineering profession is very, very well advanced. And effectively, in their low-income areas, they were faced with the same problems that many of the slums in African cities and Asian cities have had. So I think there's a great opportunity to develop good network systems. But again, as Stefan was saying, it relies on this link from community-based, community-managed, even community-constructed infrastructure systems, how they connect into the municipal side. And this is where there needs to be innovations in local authority, governance and management. I've seen this happen in many places where if a municipal government takes sufficient interest in provision of good network services, it can really be a success. And bearing in mind, most of the people who live in the slums are probably the workforce for the industries. So, you know, there's a hidden cost there. If you're providing these people with services and reducing chances of disease epidemics, it's going to affect, you know, the productivity of the city. So I think, you know, these things are very, very important, and I think it's really important that we focus a lot more on provision in slums. One last point about slums. If urbanization proceeds in an inefficient way and cities sprawl and populations are dispersed, the cost of infrastructure provision becomes very expensive. So one of the great things about dense slums is that the per capita cost of giving people services is much lower. It's basic, you know, basic. But people forget that when they're making the estimations. And in actual fact, provision of a network system in a slum can in fact be cheaper to maintain than an on-site system with collection and add-ons. So it's very important to understand that. But thanks for your question, very, very good.
I just wanted to quickly add, by the way, oh, sorry, that, you know, it seems like one of the examples of where it did finally work is a classic one in Hamburg. 1892, you had the 10,000 people die of cholera in 6 weeks because you had this very unequal system, the same way that you do in many countries now around the world. Not so, you know, so not so much time difference there.
Never spoil a good catastrophe for initiating change, right? Again, the sheer existence of an informal settlement or a slum is a governance question. Why do people rent or stay somewhere where it's not a formal planned area? So probably somebody has an interest. So if you start now intervening there with some infrastructure or some kind of infrastructure, you may step on somebody's toes. So this needs to be solved politically. Water is a political animal, like many of us have experienced. So everyone has an interest there. I would like to refer to the learnings from a study from WaterAid about 5 tiger states in Asia. How did they manage, like South Korea or Taiwan or Singapore or Malaysia, how did they manage to transform the sector from unserved within a comparatively short time span? So the point there was, first of all, political will, and then the willingness to take decisions. And number 3, to learn and review and look what worked and what did not work. Nobody will have the silver bullet. What I'm afraid of right now in our situation, that we may be hesitant. There are some experts who talk about biomembrane reactors instead of activated sludge system, blah, blah. So this is actually preventing us from really progressing stepwise. So this is interesting reading. We have it also in our report from a symposium in November 2015. I'm happy to share it with you. So this kind of part, and with this, I'd like to hear your comments, Manuel, on that one.
Thank you, Stefan. The very interesting. Thanks for asking it, because we didn't bring it up ourselves. Or let me start perhaps with Hamburg. The cholera epidemic in 1892 in Hamburg. Why did it happen? It happened because the water was taken from the Elbe River without any treatment. Water treatment plants as a technology, drinking water treatment plants, existed in 1892 for a couple of decades. Other cities had it. In Hamburg, they decided, no, we don't want to make all this too expensive, raise taxes and so on. So they were a bit cheap, and it cost tens of thousands of people their lives. So it comes back to the issue of taxes. Taxes are very important. And in some of the countries where we work, you're not economists, but perhaps you know that the share that the public sector has in GDP in Germany is almost 50%. And Germany is a wealthy, well-functioning country. We always complain as Germans about it, but look at the rest of the world. We're well off. And I work in countries where the share of taxes in GDP is 10%, and the public sector is a bit more with debt and social security, but it's extremely low. With such a weak state, it's very difficult to do anything. Now let's come back to slums. I mean, in slums, let's talk about different types of slums. Let's talk about the slums without land tenure, where you just have shacks, right? That's what people look at when this is. The actual definition is slightly different. But let's look at this type of slum. They usually have latrines, and often they are emptied manually, right? And the public sector is doing nothing about it. While the public sector builds sewers in other parts of the city where people have land tenures. They have right to their land. Usually they start with the well-off parts of the city. And actually it's subsidized because the sewer tariff, sanitation tariff is extremely low. So public money indirectly goes to the better off parts of the city, and the slums are left to fend for themselves. And why isn't there a public system, a tax-financed system, at least to empty those latrines? I mean, there are technologies to go even into the tiniest alleys in slums, because big trucks cannot enter usually. But there are smart people have invented these things. Let's go in there and they suck out the shit, pardon my English, or my French. But this is not publicly financed. These are small, NGOs are very creative. They come up with these technologies and little pilot projects, but it's not brought out, it's not mainstreamed, it's not upscaled because the funding is not there. Now, before I finish, just let's talk about the other type of so-called slums that fall under the definition of slums, where people don't have land tenure, but they have still started to build illegally some type of housing that is a bit more solid. And this brings me to Senegal, because I just came back from Senegal, and I was there in a former slum, which was a slum 20 years ago, and people have gotten land tenure, and it has really changed their lives. When they have started to invest, they have received public infrastructure, roads. The roads are now big enough so that the truck emptiers, the bigger ones, can come in. They still haven't got sanitation, by the way. They got water, but not sanitation. And I asked why. I mean, they put asphalt on the streets, but there are no sewers down there. And they said, well, we thought about it, of course, but the bulk infrastructure for the sewers, the pumping stations, the larger sewers, to get all the stuff out, were not there. So you're in the middle of the city. If you don't have a master plan and you don't take into your hands the hundreds of millions of dollars it costs in a metropolitan area like Dakar in Senegal to start the whole thing, you cannot do it for one neighborhood. So they actually paved the streets, and under the streets they just had water, they had no sewers. So it's quite frustrating. But nevertheless, they had land tenure, they have the roads, they have the water supply, and the people are much better off right now. So, and this was financed by German Development Corporation, and I've seen a lot of failures of projects, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So on that trip, I was with some caveats. I was happy to see that the slum has been transformed into something better, and hopefully one day they will also have sewers. Right now, they just have the latrines and septic tanks that are being emptied by the trucks that now can get into the streets, into the neighborhood.
Thank you for the first question. Who has another one?
Hi, this is a very interesting discussion. I'm Sophia, and I work in health policy analysis and public policy analysis. So we've heard about good governance and political will for countries such as Taiwan and South Korea and Singapore. We've heard about successful grassroots examples where NGOs kick in at slum level, and with that great example of Senegal. What's happening in more dysfunctional societies that are rich but have poor governance? And what happens, who fills in the gap? And what about water being a big business with huge companies such as Nestle starting to enter these markets? And what are the other obstacles you face in systems where there is no political will or agreement that this is really the way to go as a public sector commitments? I mean, we all agree that there's a lot of good things going on, but where are the real difficulties and the big fights going on in that field?
Who wants to answer?
Let me make a start. Actually, to get your question right, we have been describing a few cases and how to deal with that. You are asking now where are the real problems, for example, where water is a big business which is benefiting. So I think there are two parts of it. One is, I think it's an evidence that poor people who are purchasing water at water vendors generally pay much more for the water than in better off areas which have piped connection. The involvement of private companies like Nestle, I know Nestle for selling water bottles or bottled water. There are many other companies who are making business with bottled water, and for an intermediary time purchasing. If you live in an area which is not yet covered, you may have no choice but to buy in those from private resellers or from public utilities. So in an intermediate time, I mean, it's often non-governmental organizations who step in a situation where the public governance is not functional. So meaning that also on a long term, even if it comes to sanitation on wheels or fecal sludge management or emptying with vacuum trucks and so on, or mobile water vending, at the end, the responsibility for the service needs to stay with a politically responsible unit, which in most cases is the municipality. So there's a transitory role, and I see that transitory role for non-governmental organizations like ours twofold. One is help the population survive for a specific time, but the other part is really to get stakeholders together and find out how this service could be done better by those who are responsible for that. This is how I would put it. Maybe somebody else would like to step in.
I think the issue is a very pertinent question. I mean, I'm of for me, the communities I've seen, I think there's a huge untapped resourcefulness, if you like, in many of the communities who are in these situations. And I know that in places where they don't have secure tenure, that's not a complete impediment for them to get access to services. There are ways of doing it. And one of the things that has to be done is to empower the communities, maybe in other areas. I've been doing some very interesting work on providing slum dwellers with a physical address. And in many parts of the world, if a slum dweller, regardless of the tenure they're on, if they don't have a physical address, they can't get a mobile phone, they can't get a water connection, they can't even get a bank account. So if you look a little bit wider than water and you see what you can give to these communities to empower them, you then open the door. I mean, the CEO of Nairobi Water has said to me, if you can find a way of giving a water bill to the people in the slums, they will buy water at the price I sell it to the rest of the people in Nairobi. And Nairobi Water will be very happy with that, and everyone would be happy. So it's the ability for those people to have a physical address or a geographical reference to where they live that's stopping them from getting access to services. So, you know, that's one good example. The other issue is that sometimes we have to consider other elements of basic services. The Deputy Minister was going on about this concept of basic services, and certainly in dense urban areas, you can't just consider one without the other. So this idea of getting communities together to plan what their priorities are, bearing in mind, yes, of course, water's going to be high up on the list, but there may be some other priorities that we don't always consider. I had a very interesting project in Kibera in Nairobi, where we, in one village of Kibera, were looking at the provision of communal facilities, toilets and showers for the communities. But basically, the community said that they wanted a road. So UN Habitat went in and they built a road, working with the communities to decide where the road went and who would have to move. And then the water and sanitation facilities were an add-on after the road. But actually, if you go back there, this is 10 years ago, if you go back now and look at that area, you'll find that the economic uplift, the improvement in the economic conditions of those people that's been brought by the road, not the toilets, is the important issue. And the government are so happy with this that they've funded its expansion into the rest of the slum. So an unintended consequence of us being asked to look at water and sanitation, but also consider the road, meant the project worked and it was a success. And in fact, if you go to this particular area, the public space that you've given to the community in the form of the road is where they socialize in the evening. It's the, you know, like the piazza, where they go and sit in the evening and socialize. And when I speak to some of these community members, you know, what the impact of the project has been, and many of them said to me, quite surprisingly, we feel that you've given us back clean air because we don't have to smell shit everywhere we go now because the space is open and the road has given us back some of this slum. So, I mean, I think we have to look a bit wider. We have to consider what the community want and be a little bit more adventurous in these slum upgrading projects.
Thank you. Alexandra, you want to?
Well, no, ladies first.
Thank you. Some of what you were saying, Graham, it reminded me of, so we're working with an entrepreneur this year, Swapnal, who runs a community toilet program in slums. And he doesn't charge for the sanitation services. What he does is they're provided free, but you join a rewards program called Lou Rewards, and it tracks every time you use the toilet. But then you can also funnel other activities through your Lou Rewards membership. So it provides an address for you. You can have a bank account. They have a kiosk next to the toilets where you can buy your health insurance, you can lease your phone, you can get it repaired, all those sort of things. So really expanding the concept of the toilets well beyond the toilet into that sort of community hub, and how many other services that people might be more willing to pay for can you sort of bundle together with the service that you want to provide them to make it a more received or, you know, appealing service offering for that community. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. Manuel?
I understood your question to be a bit different from the previous one. So we talked again about slums, but I think you also asked about what to do if the governance is poor, which is a slightly different question. And in our work, we are constantly faced with the situations that we have communities or countries that are very poor, that are in need, but the governance framework is not conducive. And it's a very tough choice. Personally, I would argue for going in with small pilot projects. I mean, NGOs, smaller projects, but I would not give large sums of money under these conditions. I would rather put the money into situations where the governance is right and the conditions for success are there. But I've also worked in Haiti, which is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, in small towns where we had a rural water supply program. And the challenges were enormous. I designed the program, I started working on it, and my colleagues, or at least the completion report by the World Bank says, and I still can't believe it, but it says it has been a great success. I'm not sure how they've done it. I wish I could go back there and to see it, but the conditions were really very difficult. So I would caution into moving into with larger funds into difficult environments.
Can I have an answer to that one? Interestingly, the department which is financially supporting from the ministry our work is not called something about water and sanitation. It's about structural support. So at the end, if our work has an impact, you can see new bylaws, you can see new regulation. This is actually what we aim for, and not a pump which then doesn't work after some time. So it's this kind of structural change which we don't have a real expression for. We talk about technology, transfer technology, export activities, but nobody talks about structural export. It's maybe also the wrong term, but it's about getting into a dialogue and say, well, when we have been tackling the issue about cholera in Hamburg, this is what we thought would be the solution. If we would do it once more, maybe we would do it in a different way. So this is kind of structural change influencing governance, because if governance is not changing, better don't spend any penny on that, or you have actually an emergency situation. So this goes all back to the situation that water is a political animal, and if there's no water and sanitation service, it tells you something about the power structure in the country and not necessarily about the technology.
There was another question over there, please. Yeah. Okay.
My name is Frank Bogada. I'm a freelance consultant on water and environment, and also representing a small NGO called Water Solutions International. I would like to ask you, what's your opinion on demand for sanitation? I mean, we all agree that technology, okay, that's never a big problem, everything is possible. But how come that most people in many countries are more interested in the latest mobile phone than having a decent toilet at home or having their wastewater treated? Yeah? Is there any experience with you that could be shared with us? Where are the solutions for that basic problem? And I'm recently a team leader for a very big project of the Asian Development Bank in Vietnam. We are spending $150 million on water and sanitation. The budget for public awareness campaigns is zero. This goes with many of the KfW, GIZ, World Bank, whatever projects. The budgets for public awareness are somewhere between 0 and 3%. So I think this has to be changed. And what is your opinion on that?
Who wants to go first? Schnick, schnack, schnuck.
Go ahead. I think that the issue is that, I mean, it's very difficult to get particularly low-income people to completely understand the health impacts of provision of water and sanitation. But I think the people who should be made to understand it better are at the local authority level. Because I feel that, you know, in many cases, it's a mayor, she or he sat down with their medical officer and their environmental health officer and their city engineer. They should understand, looking at municipal budgets, that they should be stimulating the demand for sanitation to save money on healthcare costs. So I think there's a need, really, if we're going to see changes in the way people understand this, we want to, I think, yes, we can do awareness creation with the community, but we also need to focus some of that budget at the next level up. Not talking about ministerial level, we're talking about low-level community leaders, mayors, and civic leaders who can really be availed of this information to understand the impact it would have. So for me, that's an area I think we need to do more work on.
There are two levels to this question. One is, nothing lets your car look older than the new car of your neighbor, right? So if there's new decent infrastructure in the neighborhood, that may trigger interest in, how did you get there, and so on. Point two, it depends very much on the cultural context. Which area? Is it Vietnam? Is it Indonesia? Is it some African countries? So what mobilizes interest is very much site-specific and cultural related. Number three, I believe still that political leadership is the key. So if there's money, if there are budgets from the, for example, Asian Development Bank, and if those decisions on the transformation of clusters of the city or parts of the town, if that is backed by political leadership in the People's Committee and so on, then I wouldn't see the big problem. The last mile connection and the user fee is another point of debate where the user says, okay, if I'm not getting 24 hours, 7 days a week service, why should I pay? And so on. So if we address user fees, it's a different discussion. If we address infrastructure rehabilitation or upgrade, I would rather see the political level involved. But maybe it's a good question to go deeper in with a beer after the event. But first of all, this part of the row should add to the discussion. Yeah.
I'll jump in there, and I'm happy to discuss this after as well. I'd love to. This is my favorite side of the discussion. I mean, this, for us at least, is really where the private sector can shine. We spend the majority of our budgets on things because we want them, not because we think they're good for us, or we think it's good to do it. We're marketed to for our food, for our phones, for our cars, as you said. So why should sanitation be different in these contexts? We spend a lot of time with the businesses that we're talking about. I mean, it's an education campaign, but it's an advertising campaign. You have to educate your consumer to make them want your product. That's what happens to us all day, every day. And so one of the way, for me at least, where I get so excited about it is, as I said, the smart sanitation side. You know, they're willing to pay for Wi-Fi, they're willing to buy, they all have phones. You know, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but the majority of the population has a mobile phone. So how can we tie that in with sanitation? How can we work with what we have for some of these consumers to really change the behavior, rather than continuing to just educate them on why they need a toilet? Why don't we make them want the toilet? And how can we do that?
Thank you. First of all, you're a great audience. These are all wonderful questions. I mean, the awareness one or the behavior change, I mean, it's such a difficult issue. I mean, first, I agree, often the money just goes to infrastructure. It doesn't go to changing the awareness. But we also have cases where money is put on awareness campaigns, but they are completely ineffective. People still don't like to have a toilet. So what has gone wrong? I mean, you certainly can't sit in front of adult people and tell them, you should have a toilet because look here, there's an F diagram with fecal coliforms and public health and so on. And some of these people might be illiterate in rural areas, and there are some beliefs that might seem strange to us. Some people believe that they get sick from the smell of feces, right? So changing that belief is incredibly difficult. You might have to start at school. It will take a generation to change this. You should certainly use, and I agree with Alexandra, right? Yeah. With Alexandra, the private sector has a lot to offer in terms of, you said, educating people. You could also say, well, manipulating people into buying something, into buying what you want to sell. And let's take soap. I mean, we haven't talked about hygiene yet, yeah? So how does a private company sell soap They don't tell you, look at public health impacts of soap and you're not going to get sick. No, they tell you, this is wonderful for your skin. We have the best soap so that you will have a shiny and healthy skin. And so they know how to sell things. And perhaps we have to make use of some of this expertise. Let me add perhaps the last example, because many of you know it's a total sanitation campaign in India. I mean, they basically created public pressure, and it's a bit of controversial, but they said everybody in the village should have a toilet, and then you're going to get a reward from the government. And for a while it really worked, and there are even these signs in Hindi. I've seen pictures of them. I'm not sure how common they were. They said, we are not going to marry our daughters to someone from a village that doesn't have toilets, right? So it was a nice campaign, but I also heard that most of the toilets that were built from scratch, and they fell down, and if you come back a few years later, they fall into disuse. So even if you have very ingenious ways of trying to create awareness, unfortunately you have some rollback or some slowing down.
Thank you. There are at least 2 more questions. So this is the part of the panel discussion where I have to look sternly at all of you and ask you for short answers. The gentleman in the back there.
My name is Somo Seyosh. I'm from Cameroon. I am a consultant by profession, but currently I'm a final year master's student here in Germany at the University of Cottbus, BTU Cottbus. Before I ask a question, I would actually like to make a contribution, because it's not actually necessarily right for me to just go ahead with the question, because it's not going to fulfill my purpose here. What I would like to ask is that, what my contribution, first of all, is that coming from being, during my period as a consultant and having traveled to so many other countries and visiting some remote locations, I realized that in some of the most poorest communities in Africa, where you have the most of cholera outbreaks, the people don't have toilets. And sometimes when there are floods, and it contaminates some of the water sources, and there's cholera outbreaks. And I realized that in most of those communities, the people actually who don't have toilets totally depend on cash crops for their livelihood. And this cash crop, most of these cash crops are coffee and cocoa. And the major buyers of this coffee and cocoa are companies like Nestle and Unilever. And if you look into it detailedly, let me say, since the independence of many African countries, and many Africans like myself had gotten actually good educations. I'm not the only one. There are so many others in top universities with good expertise. But it is unimaginable that up to this present extent, many African countries are still depending on the direct exportation of raw materials like cocoa and coffee. It is not because the expertise is lacking, because you have so many process engineers. I have so many friends from Cameroon, where I come from, who are process engineers. And the problem which is there is that companies like Nestle have been blocking the possibility of many African countries who depend solely on cocoa and coffee to be able to do a value added to their cocoa and coffee. Because when these countries do a value added onto their cocoa and coffee, it is going to cut 70% of Nestle's profit. Just imagine, in my country, Cameroon, a kilo of cocoa costs 1,500 francs, which is €3. And that same kilo of cocoa can probably produce about 60 to 70 bars of chocolate. So if you kind of improve value added to, as I said, I would like to make a contribution before asking my question. Companies like...
Could you come to the question?
Yeah. Companies like Nestle, Nestle and Unilever, I want to ask, first of all, if this company actually are not doing greenwashing as per se, why can they not take the proposal that have been made by so many people who are actually interested in sorting out these problems? Because in these rural communities, if they could buy if they could buy these poor farmers' products with the actual price which is necessary, I don't think they wouldn't be able to afford.
Could you maybe phrase a question to our panelists?
So I want to ask what, like a group that's working with, an organization which is working with companies like Unilever and Nestle. What is what are some of the proposals you are bringing to them as to this aspect? Because, and then second question is that
I'm not sure that any of the Graham wants to relate to your question.
Secondly, is that I want to give a statistic.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to cut you short now.
Yeah, it's the last. It's a statistic. Every year, Africa lost $50 billion from tax evasion, and the accumulated sum, the accumulated amount has been estimated to 300.
Tax evasion was a topic earlier.
The estimated sum has been the accumulated sum has been estimated to $3 trillion. Okay. So, do you think with $3 trillion, if these companies are being imposed, if these companies are being requested to pay their taxes, do you think it will not go a long way to reduce maybe some of the contribution that some NGOs are making in this light?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what Manuel said earlier. So, Graham, would you like
to... Can I just make... thank you very much for your question. I think you brought up a very important issue in relation to corporate social responsibility. And one of the things we're trying to do, I'm doing a lot of work on the wastewater part of the water goal, and I want to hold a lot of these big industries more accountable. And if we start to hold them more accountable in terms of the amount of water that they use and the waste that they discharge, and we get more information on their operations and what they do, we can then dig a little bit deeper into how their operations are working and learn some very important issues which can contribute to the sort of issues that you were talking about. So I'm very much in favour of working, in fact we're working very closely with some of the private sector organisations to try and pull this idea of corporate social responsibility in. It's a very, very important issue. Thanks.
Thank you. And there was another question over there.
Can I quickly add one thing?
Okay.
It was a long question or a long talk, so one quick answer is maybe not enough. But what you are putting here on the table is a general questioning of international collaboration, and water may be a symptom or part of the overall relationship, how countries deal with each other. I wanted to contribute there an experience from 3 years ago. We have joined the Alliance for Water Stewardship. So the Alliance for Water Stewardship is trying to, and they have developed a standard which was co-developed by World Wildlife Fund and non-profit organizations, professionals, but also with a person representing Nestle and others. So here's the story. Nestle itself, in this case, and I'm only referring to that, I don't claim to know everything about everywhere Nestle was quoted and so on. But like Coca-Cola, they are owing a certain brand, and they do have relations with operators in the countries. So the operators in the countries may not be Nestlé, but they are producing on behalf if they fulfill all the processes and so on. So now, why has Nestlé joined the Alliance for Water Stewardship? Because they want that the product they are selling is part of the good product. So water stewardship in this sense means I don't only care about the water inside the bottle, but I'm contributing to making my business transparent to those upstream and downstream, because I don't want my product to be blamed for not following water stewardship standards. So that is one of the little ways the guy from Nestlé in Geneva could influence local licensees in order to follow these kind of production procedures. So I believe that the power lies in the fact that, for example, if Nile fish, to give another example from Nestlé, if fish which comes from Lake Victoria is marketed in Edeka in Cottbus or in Berlin, if that fish gets a video feature about the poor quality conditions of how the fish is produced and so on, then people get a problem. So they rather than engage in those framework conditions on having a good quality product. So this kind of mechanism, I think, we need to approach very concrete in order to overcome, because at the end, everyone is interested in having thriving and wealthy African countries, because then they will be much more interesting for international trade anyhow. So I think nobody wants to keep business and development in the countries down, because then it's not interesting for international community at all. So sorry for overstepping my time budget, but okay.
That's okay. There was more than one sentence, though, even for a German. So thank you all for your questions and contributions. I would like to go back to a last panel round. Alexandra, the Toilet Board Coalition has basically just started their work. What has been the biggest surprise so far?
Yes, great question. The biggest surprise.
Like good surprise.
Yeah, good surprise.
Possible too.
Yeah, no, I mean, well, let me just be short. I mean, first of all, last year with the Toilet Accelerator, it was our first year running the program. So there was a big question mark at the end of the year in terms of did it work? And so for me, the biggest surprise was getting the results back from Garima at Svada, who said, gave us her new sales projections and her revenue report, and that was the best surprise.
And what do you think? What can you do in the way of reaching the SDG 6, clean water and sanitation for all? Like, what's the part of the Toilet Board Coalition that's going to be most important to reach that goal?
Yeah, so our role in that is scaling up small and medium enterprises that are serving the unserved customer. Yes.
That was one sentence. Thank you. Manuel, we already talked about that you don't have the perfect solution, but again, keeping the SDGs in mind, what do you think is most important looking at your data for what works in water and sanitation?
Knowledge, financing, and governance.
Thank you. I take short answers. Graham, you told me my first love is wastewater. I wrote that down because it was such a nice sentence. So my first love is wastewater, and you also said, I want to start a revolution. Tell me more about that revolution.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. No, it's true. I mean, after my wife, of course, wastewater, it's very close.
Of course.
Second.
Of course.
But, the thing about what strikes me about wastewater and why it's such an important issue is that, and this is really linked to why I think there's a need for revolution. About 100 or so years ago, in many cities around the world, here in Germany, where I'm from in London, and in other continents, you know, there was this sudden realization driven by, in the case of London, it was a great stink. You know, the Houses of Parliament closed down because the Thames was polluted. But it took that issue to launch this investment in two things, trunk public infrastructure, but also working with the local communities, understanding what the risks were, and reducing the health risks from dealing with waste, providing people with clean water to drink. And also, in many cities, even then, it was a question of air pollution. So when I say sanitary revolution, I mean we have to look at those environmental determinants which are killing most of the people in not just the developing world still, but also now in some of the developing nations. I mean, you know, the situation in London with air pollution, it's one of the worst cities in the world. So the sanitary revolution really is really to try and trigger within all of the actors, because everyone's doing good things in their own way, but to work together and to look at things in perspective. And I think one of the things I hope it will do is that for certain, you know, the development banks and other funders who are designing projects in countries, is to get them to make sure they consider properly all the elements of what brings about a good, in this case, waste management or a sanitary revolution. And I think if it's marketed like that, and it's done, I think there's a great opportunity, and I think we could start a second revolution again, and we could benefit from the impacts, not just in the developing world, but also in many of the developed economies as well.
Thank you. Stefan, we're coming back to the anniversary we're celebrating today with all of you. When you enter your private time machine now and beam yourself to the 50th birthday of BORDA in 10 years, what has to happen in these 10 years so that you will look back and say, those were golden years for water and sanitation?
Thank you for this kind of question. I'd say, number one, I like very much the term of sanitary revolution. What needs to take place, number two, and now I'm picking up on Manuel's comment on finance. I think for the sanitation sector, we need an instrument like IFIM and Gavi for vaccination and immunization. I think we need a financing instrument which goes beyond electional cycles, which looks at the 15 years ahead, so at the 55th birthday or something like that, so that we really can go over the loopholes of governmental decision-making on financing and so on. The third part really is to take those kind of dialogues between private sector, finance, UN, and civil society beyond nice rooms like this one and get into action on the ground through really not only dialogue but process facilitation where everyone plays its role, and we can get these systems on the ground.
Thank you very much.
All right.
So you heard it, there is a need and an initiative, as I heard from you two, to start a second revolution, a second sanitary revolution. And if you want to join in, please don't hesitate to contact our panelists of today. You can contact them via social media, via email, or right now with a glass of wine or beer or water or juice in your hand, and with a few canapes out there. Thank you all for joining us, for taking an interest, for being here tonight, and for watching online. Thank you for making the trip to Berlin, to those of you who came here, especially for tonight. And thank you also for sharing your ideas and experiences with us. And dear Ulrike Hiller, thank you for having us here at the Landesvertretung Bremen in Berlin. And now let's all celebrate 40 years of BORDA.